Stephen Easton's hand stilled on the warehouse railing when the side door creaked open and a child stepped into the shadows alone. No parent followed. No protector materialized behind her small frame. Just a 7-year-old girl in a pale dress with a crimson bow, scanning the industrial interior with eyes that had learned to map escape routes before learning to read chapter books. One of his men moved to intercept, hand already reaching for the weapon beneath his jacket. But Julie Daniels sidestepped him with practiced ease. She navigated worse threats than armed criminals. Her small white shoes left prints in the concrete dust as she moved between pallets where men counted money in silence, and deals were sealed with nods rather than handshakes. Stephen had released the railing with deliberate control, his knuckles white from the pressure. He'd chosen this elevated position for its tactical advantage. Back to the brick wall, clear view of all entrances, proximity to the emergency exit concealed behind stacked crates. Tonight, those instincts served a different purpose as he tracked the child's determined approach through his territory. The others hadn't noticed yet, too absorbed in their own careful business. A lieutenant verified serial numbers on counterfeit detection pins. 2 enforcers played cards with the concentration of men killing time between violence. The distant sound of traffic on the interstate provided a constant urban rhythm that never quite penetrated the warehouse's thick walls. Julie stopped in a shaft of light streaming through the high windows, her small hands clutching a red envelope that seemed too bright for this gray place. She didn't look around nervously or second-guess her choice. She'd made her decision before crossing that threshold, and children who lived with monsters learned not to waste time on hesitation. Stephen descended the metal stairs without sound, each footfall measured. He observed her with the same intensity he brought to interrogations where lives hung on the detection of lies. The red ribbon barely contained her light brown ponytail. The way her dress had been carefully pressed despite its age. The tension in her small shoulders, as if she was bracing for a blow that had become routine. The way her fingers trembled despite her determined expression, like someone forcing themselves to touch something burning because there was no alternative. She placed the envelope on an empty oil drum between them, the metal surface scarred with use. The gesture was formal despite her obvious fear. The envelope was store-bought, but had been decorated with careful crayon drawings, flowers and hearts that suggested a child who still believed in beauty despite what she'd witnessed. It landed with barely a sound, yet somehow carried more weight than anything else in this warehouse built for heavy things. "If I pay, can you scare the monsters in my house?" Her voice came out steady, rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this moment in bathroom mirrors until the words no longer broke. She met his gaze without flinching, and Stephen recognized that particular brand of courage, the kind born from having exhausted every other option and finding them all locked doors. The question hung in the air between them, while the warehouse continued its criminal rhythm. Someone dropped a stack of bills with a soft thud. Metal scraped against concrete as a crate was repositioned. The interstate's distant hum provided the soundtrack to countless illegal transactions, indifferent and eternal. Stephen's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a door opening to a room he'd boarded up years ago, where a different child had hidden and waited for rescue that never came. He didn't reach for the envelope, didn't dismiss her with a gesture that made grown men retreat. Instead, he lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself closer to her eye level, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that the wrong movement could shatter something already cracked. "What kind of monsters?" His voice was lower than the ambient noise, rough from disuse of gentleness, forcing her to lean in slightly. He watched her process the question, saw the moment she decided whether to speak the truth or retreat into the safety of metaphor. Children who approached men like him in places like this had already burned through every safer alternative. Julie's fingers twisted the edge of her crimson bow, creating wrinkles in the carefully tied silk. Mommy wears scrubs and works at the hospital when the sun goes down. That's when Larry comes home instead. The name carried weight she didn't elaborate on. I didn't need to. Stephen understood the language of fear spoken in careful omissions and strategic silences. He'd been fluent once, in a different city in a different decade, before he became the man who made others speak that language. He smells like the bottles Mommy hides in the high cabinet, the one she says I'm never supposed to touch. Her voice dropped to a whisper, as if the monster might hear even across the city's distance, even through concrete and steel. His footsteps shake the floor. His voice makes the walls crack. Or maybe they were already cracked, and I just notice them more when he's yelling. She described the nightly ritual with the detachment of a witness giving testimony, each word carefully chosen to maintain composure. How the front door would crash open. How the shouting started quiet and built like thunder rolling closer. How she'd learned to make herself invisible in the bathroom closet, sitting in the tub behind a shower curtain, breathing through her mouth so she wouldn't smell the alcohol that announced his arrival like a warning siren. Stephen's jaw tightened incrementally with each detail, tension that started at his temples and worked down to his hands, which had curled into fists without his conscious decision. His men continued their business around them, unaware that a child was describing a war zone that existed just miles from this warehouse, in a neighborhood with lawn signs and welcome mats, where violence hid behind suburban normalcy. Mommy doesn't know I'm awake, Julie continued, her gaze dropping to the red envelope between them. She thinks I sleep through it because I stay quiet. But I hear everything. The things he says about her job, about her helping other people when she should be home, about how she thinks she's too good for him now. Stephen remained motionless, but his mind was calculating with the precision that had built his empire from nothing. The child before him represented a variable he hadn't anticipated when he'd come here to review quarterly earnings. Her presence disrupted the careful separation he maintained between Stephen Easton, the businessman, and Stephen Easton, the man who remembered being small and helpless. How much is in there? He gestured toward the envelope with his chin, still not touching it, as if physical contact would seal some contract he wasn't sure he should make. His question was careful, despite his reputation for voices that could end negotiations before they started. Julie picked up the envelope and opened it with small, deliberate fingers. She tipped the contents in her palm, then onto the oil drum's scarred surface. $47.50. Bills folded to look like more than they were. Quarters that caught the industrial light and reflected it back like armor. I've been saving since my birthday in June, she said, and pride crept into her voice alongside the fear. $10 from Grandma before she died. $20 for my birthday. $5 from returning bottles. The quarters I found, one under the vending machine at school, one in the parking lot at Mommy's hospital, one from the wishing fountain at the park where people throw away luck. The mathematics of her desperation laid out in currency that amounted to nothing in Stephen's world. He negotiated deals worth hundreds of thousands where men sweated over percentage points. None of those transactions had carried the weight of this money saved from forgotten places by a child who believed safety could be purchased. "That's not enough," he said quietly, watching her face begin to crumble, the careful composure fracturing, before he continued. "Because you can't pay for something like this. Not with money. Not with anything." He paused, letting the words settle like sediment. "Take it back. You've already paid more than anyone should have to." Julie's confusion manifested in the slight tilt of her head, the way children process information that contradicts everything they've learned. She'd prepared for rejection, maybe even for mockery. She hadn't prepared for this particular form of acceptance that came wrapped in refusal. "But I have to pay," she insisted with the logic of someone who'd learned too early that nothing comes free, that survival requires transaction. That's how it works. You can't just get things without giving something back. "Mommy says people who take without paying are—" She stopped, searching for the word. "Thieves," Stephen finished for her. "Your mother is right. But this isn't a transaction, Julie." He used her name, though she hadn't offered it, and her eyes widened at the realization that he knew more than she'd told him. Information was his business, and even a child arrival didn't happen in his territory without him learning the context. "This is something different." She gathered the money with both hands, cradling it against her chest as if it might escape. Her lips pressed together in a thin line that aged her face beyond its years. She'd come here with a plan, and adults who dismiss children's plans were just another kind of monster. "Then how do I know you'll really do it?" The challenge in her voice was sharp, desperate, the question of someone who'd learned that promises without collateral were just pretty lies. Stephen looked at this 7-year-old girl who'd walked into hell to find a devil and asked him to fight on her behalf. He saw himself reflected in her eyes. Not who he'd become, but who he'd been. The boy who'd hidden and hoped and been failed by every system designed to protect him. "You don't," he said simply, his voice carrying a weight that made his nearby men glance over despite themselves. "You walk out of here and you go home and you wait. Maybe nothing changes. Maybe everything does. But you don't wait because I promised. You wait because you've already decided that's what you're going to do anyway, because you're braver than most adults I know." He stood slowly, his full height casting her in shadow. "Keep your money, Julie. Buy yourself something that makes you smile. And go home." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a certainty that was more binding than any contract. "The monsters won't bother you much longer." Julie studied his face with the intensity of someone reading a map to survival, looking for the markers that distinguished safe territory from dangerous ground. Then she nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and turned toward the door. Her pale dress, with its crimson bow, caught the light as she navigated back through the shadows, a spot of innocence retreating from darkness, carrying her $47.50 and something more valuable. The first hope she'd felt in longer than she could remember. The side door closed behind her with a soft click that echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. Stephen remained frozen in position, staring at the empty oil drum where a child's desperate offering had briefly rested. Around him, his men had returned to their business, knowing better than to question when their boss went still like this, when his jaw set in that particular way that meant decisions were being made. He pulled out his phone and typed a single message to his most trusted lieutenant, Larry Fletcher. "I need everything by morning. Everything." Then Stephen Easton stood in the industrial half-light of his kingdom built on fear and violence, and for the first time in 20 years, remembered what it felt like to be 7 years old and terrified, waiting for someone, anyone, to care enough to make the monsters stop. The red envelope sat between them like evidence at a crime scene, and Julie's small voice filled the warehouse with details that made Stephen's chest tighten in ways bullets never had. Larry Fletcher wasn't just a name. He was a nightly countdown to terror that began the moment her mother's car pulled out of the driveway for the evening shift at County General. He comes home around 9, Julie said, her fingers still twisted in her dress. Sometimes earlier if they kick him out of McCready's bar. I can hear his truck from 3 blocks away because the muffler's broken. That's when I go hide. Her matter-of-fact tone was worse than tears would have been. The bathroom closet. I sit in the tub behind the shower curtain with my stuffed rabbit. Sometimes I'm there until after midnight. Stephen's jaw clenched hard enough that his back molars ached. She described the progression with the precision of someone who'd studied survival. The front door slamming, footsteps heavy on the stairs, Larry's voice starting as a growl and escalating into roars that made picture frames rattle. The sound of breaking glass. Her mother's pleading voice trying to de-escalate. The words Larry used that Julie was too young to fully understand, but old enough to know were meant to destroy. I heard some 8th graders talking, she continued, answering the question he hadn't yet asked. Tommy Breslin's older brother said even the cops are scared of Stephen Easton from the warehouse. I looked it up on the library computer, found the address. She met his eyes with startling directness. If everyone's afraid of you, I figure maybe Larry would be too. The logic was sound in the way only a desperate child's logic could be. Simple, strategic, and heartbreaking. Stephen looked at the money she'd gathered, the birthday bills and scavenged quarters representing months of hope accumulated in secret. Little girls shouldn't have to buy safety, he said, his voice rougher than intended. They should just have it. But I don't. Julie shot back, and suddenly she wasn't small anymore, wasn't helpless. Nobody does anything. The school counselor says to tell a trusted adult. Mommy says she's handling it. The police say they need evidence. So I'm asking you. The warehouse air felt heavy between them. What makes you think I'm not a monster too? Stephen asked quietly, needing her to understand what she was asking, who she was asking. Julie tilted her head, studying him with ancient eyes in a child's face. Maybe you are, she said simply, but maybe monsters can scare other monsters. And right now, that's what I need. If you believe children deserve to feel safe in their own homes, hit that subscribe button. Only people like Larry, cowards who prey on the defenseless, would scroll past without subscribing. The warehouse emptied after midnight, his men dispersing to their territories and homes, leaving Stephen alone with the red envelope he'd placed on his desk like a grenade he wasn't sure how to defuse. He hadn't opened it, didn't need to count money that represented a child's entire concept of currency and power. The silence pressed against him, and with it came memories he'd spent 20 years burying under concrete and violence. He'd been 8 when he learned that walls weren't thick enough to muffle his father's rage. Their apartment had been smaller than this office, a 2-bedroom box where sound traveled like a contagion. Stephen had developed his own hiding place, wedged behind the couch in the living room, knees pulled to his chest, hands pressed over his ears hard enough to leave his palms aching. It never helped. He still heard everything. Still heard his mother's voice getting smaller as his father's got louder. Still heard the sounds of impact he was too young to name, but old enough to understand. His mother had worn long sleeves in summer, sunglasses indoors. She'd smiled at him like nothing was wrong, and he'd pretended to believe her because that's what children did when the truth was too heavy to carry together. The helplessness had shaped him like water carving stone, slowly, inevitably, permanently, until the summer he turned 16 and grew 6 inches in 4 months. until his shoulders filled out and his hands became weapons instead of shields. The first time he'd hit back, his father had looked genuinely surprised in the half-second before Steven's fist broke his nose. The violence he'd unleashed that day hadn't stayed contained. It became his language, his currency, his identity. By 18, he was enforcing loan sharks. By 23, he was running his own operations. By 30, men crossed the street when they saw him coming, and he'd told himself that power was the same thing as safety. But Julie Daniels had looked at him and seen something he'd forgotten he could be. Not the monster, but the monster killer. She didn't know about the broken bones he'd ordered, the businesses he'd burned, the lives he'd ruined with the same casual efficiency his father had once used to destroy his childhood. Stephen pushed back from the desk and walked out into the night, the industrial district sprawling around him like a kingdom built on fear. Sodium lights cast everything in sickly yellow. Somewhere a freight train rumbled past, indifferent and eternal. He walked until the decision crystallized into something he couldn't ignore. His phone was in his hand before he'd consciously reached for it. His second-in-command answered on the first ring, knowing better than to let Stephen's calls go to voicemail. "Larry Fletcher," Stephen said, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. "I need everything. Employment history, financials, associates, habits, weaknesses. By morning. What's the play?" Stephen looked up at the city sky, light polluted and starless. "Protective detail," he said finally. "The kind that makes problems disappear." By dawn, Stephen's people had eyes on the modest two-story house in a neighborhood where people still believed lawn gnomes and welcome mats could keep darkness at bay. The surveillance van was parked 3 houses down, cameras angled to capture every approach, every departure, every shadow moving behind curtains that promised privacy but delivered none. The dossier arrived on Stephen's tablet by 7 a.m., and Larry Fletcher's life laid itself bare in bullet points and bank statements. 38 years old, unemployed for 16 months after being fired from a warehouse job for showing up drunk, living off Claire Daniels' medical secretary salary while she worked 50-hour weeks at County General. 2 restraining orders from a previous relationship, both expired. Bar tabs at 3 establishments that had banned him for starting fights. Most damning, $15,000 in gambling debts to underground poker rooms that operated in the gray spaces where Stephen's world intersected with desperation. Claire Daniels was 32, working double shifts to keep them housed and fed, her personnel file showing perfect attendance despite the exhaustion visible in her employee photo. No family within 300 miles. No close friends that surveillance could identify. Larry had isolated her with the precision of a predator who understood that victims without witnesses were easier to control. Julie's routine was documented with efficiency that made Stephen's chest ache. School attendance was perfect despite dark circles under her eyes. After-school program until 6 p.m. Weekend sleepovers at friends' houses whenever possible. A 7-year-old learning to minimize time in her own home. Wednesday night, Stephen sat in his car across from the Daniels house, watching shadows move behind lit windows like a theater of violence playing out in silhouette. Larry arrived at 11:47 p.m., his truck's broken muffler announcing him exactly as Julie had described. The lights upstairs flickered on. Stephen watched Julie's small form appear briefly at her bedroom window before vanishing, heading for her bathroom closet hideout. The shouting started at 11:52, loud enough to carry through insulated walls and double-paned windows, loud enough that Stephen heard it clearly from the street. Larry's voice was a weapon, each word designed to wound. Claire's responses were quieter, measured, the tone of someone trying to negotiate with a natural disaster. Julie's bedroom lights stayed on until 2:17 a.m. A child awakened in the dark, counting the minutes until safety, learning that home was the most dangerous place she knew. Stephen's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, until the leather creaked under the pressure. Around him, the neighborhood slept in oblivious peace, never knowing that a child 3 houses away was living through a war that happened every night on schedule. The decision crystallized like ice forming on glass. Sudden, complete, irreversible. This ended now, not with warnings or second chances. Larry Fletcher was a problem that required permanent solutions, and Stephen had built an empire on solving problems that polite society couldn't acknowledge existed. Thursday morning, Stephen's inner circle gathered in the warehouse office where decisions that changed lives were made over coffee and cold calculation. 3 men who'd worked with him long enough to read his silences sat around the table while he laid out the problem without mentioning a 7-year-old girl with a red envelope. Larry Fletcher needs to disappear, Stephen said flatly. Permanently, but not that way. His first lieutenant spoke up. Clean removal. Make it look like he walked away. No body, no questions. It was Stephen's first instinct too. The solution his reputation was built on. Too much attention, Stephen said, surprising them. Woman files a missing person report. Police start digging. We don't need that heat. The second option came from his logistics expert. Frame him. Parole violation, outstanding warrant, something that gets him locked up for years. But even as the words hung in the air, Stephen was shaking his head. Too slow. Too many variables. Julie couldn't wait for the justice system to grind through its procedures. Then his financial officer pulled up the gambling debt spreadsheet. Fletcher owes $15,000 to the card rooms we control. He's 3 months behind, making excuses, borrowing from loan sharks to cover the interest. The man looked up with the expression of someone solving an equation. We own this problem already. The plan assembled itself with the elegance of all good traps, using the prey's own weakness as the mechanism. Larry Fletcher was a coward beneath his rage, the kind of man who only hit people who couldn't hit back. But debt collectors were different. Debt collectors represented consequences he couldn't intimidate away. Friday afternoon, 2 of Stephen's men found Larry at McCready's bar, nursing his 4th beer and working up the courage for his 5th. They wore cheap suits and carried the casual menace of men collecting on behalf of people who didn't accept excuses. The pitch was simple: work off the debt on an offshore oil rig. 6 months minimum contract. All expenses paid. Housing provided. Debt cleared upon completion. The alternative wasn't stated explicitly. It didn't need to be. Larry understood that men who came collecting didn't make social calls. Why me? Larry asked, suspicion cutting through his alcohol haze. Because you need money and we need bodies, one of the collectors said with the bored tone of someone who didn't care whether the offer was accepted or not. Take it or don't, but the debt comes due either way. Larry's psychology was transparent. Escape disguised as opportunity, a chance to run from his failures and call it ambition. He took the deal Saturday morning, signing fabricated paperwork that placed him on a rig so remote that cell service was a rumor and shore leave was quarterly at best. Sunday morning departure. Stephen's final instruction was delivered to the men handling transport. Make sure he understands that coming back early would be profoundly unwise. That the rig is the safest place he could possibly be. Sunday morning at 6 a.m., Larry Fletcher climbed into a company van with 3 other men headed for the coast. His duffel bag containing everything he'd bothered to pack from a life he was already reframing as a temporary setback rather than escape. The note he'd left on the kitchen counter claimed opportunity and fresh starts. Words designed to absolve rather than explain. Monday morning, Claire Daniels woke to silence, so profound it felt like a physical presence, like the house itself was holding its breath. No snoring from the couch. No smell of stale beer and cigarettes permeating the air. No boots by the door that she'd learned to step around like landmines. She found the note where he'd left it, weighted down by his house key, a gesture that felt more like threat than courtesy, a promise that he could reclaim access whenever he chose. But his clothes were gone from the closet, his toiletries missing from the bathroom counter. The spaces he'd occupied felt larger without him in them, as if the house itself was expanding into the vacuum his departure created. Julie emerged from her bedroom with the cautious steps of someone testing whether the ground would hold. She read her mother's face with the expertise of a child who'd learned to navigate emotional weather patterns, looking for the storm that always followed calm. He's gone. The question was barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might summon him back. Claire nodded, unable to form words past the tightness in her throat. Relief and disbelief warred in her chest. What became back tonight? What if this was just another variation of his cruelty, giving them hope before crushing it? But she made chocolate chip pancakes anyway, and they ate breakfast without the weight of pending violence pressing down on their shoulders. Julie smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, and Claire realized she hadn't seen that expression in months. The week progressed in suspended animation. Claire jumped at every knock on the door, every unexpected sound. Each night, without Larry, felt like a gift she didn't trust, like borrowed time that would come due with interest. But by Friday, the knot in her chest had loosened incrementally. She started to believe that maybe, impossibly, this might be real. Saturday brought a cleaning frenzy that was more exorcism than housekeeping. They erased Larry's presence from every room, boxing up the belongings he'd left behind and storing them in the garage like evidence of a crime that was finally being prosecuted. Julie attacked the work with fierce determination, reclaiming territory that had never truly felt like hers. The bathroom closet underwent the most dramatic transformation. Julie filled it with stuffed animals and books, converting her hideout into something that resembled childhood again. The shower curtain stayed open now. The space behind it held toys instead of terror. And when Claire found her daughter sitting in there that evening, she was reading by flashlight rather than counting minutes until safety. 2 weeks after Larry's departure, Claire opened her car loan statement to find a balance of 0 with a stamp that read paid in full. She called the bank 3 times, certain there'd been an error, receiving only confirmation that an anonymous payment had cleared the remaining $4,200 she'd been chipping away at for 3 years. 3 weeks in, an envelope appeared in her mailbox with no return address. $500 in crisp bills and a typed note for Julie's school expenses. Claire sat in her car, staring at the money, her hands shaking with something between gratitude and fear. 1 month to the day after Larry left, Claire received a call from Memorial Hospital across town. They had an opening for a medical secretary, better hours, better pay, better benefits. The timing was remarkable, the hiring manager said. Their previous secretary had just accepted a position elsewhere, and Claire's name had come highly recommended through channels the woman couldn't quite specify. Julie started seeing a therapist the school counselor suggested, sessions that should have cost Claire's entire grocery budget. Instead, she received a letter explaining that Julie qualified for a benefactor scholarship fund that covered mental health services for at-risk youth. The fund administrator couldn't provide details about the donor due to privacy agreements. The business card appeared in Claire's mailbox on a Tuesday, plain white stock with no name or logo. Just a phone number in embossed black ink and a single word, protected. Claire wasn't stupid. She'd been navigating survival long enough to recognize when circumstances exceeded coincidence. She started asking careful questions, mentioning the paid loan to her coworker, the mysterious scholarship to Julie's teacher. Responses came back vague, bureaucratic, designed to deflect rather than inform. Then a maintenance worker at the warehouse district mentioned seeing her silver Honda on security footage, asking if she'd been making deliveries in that area. She hadn't, but someone had been watching. Someone was still watching. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it settled like armor she hadn't known she needed. Mixed emotions swirled: gratitude for the help, unease at the surveillance, burning curiosity about who commanded this kind of power and why they'd chosen to deploy it on her behalf. Julie's nightmares decreased in frequency and intensity. Her grades climbed from barely passing to honor roll. Her laughter returned, tentative at first, then genuine. She stopped flinching at loud noises, stopped monitoring exits, stopped making herself small. Claire noticed the black sedan that appeared periodically near their home. Never in the same spot twice, never threatening, just present. A reminder that someone was watching, not with malice, but with protection. She could investigate further, could call the number on the business card and demand explanations. Or she could accept that someone powerful had decided they mattered, had wrapped them in safety that operated outside conventional systems. Claire chose acceptance. Some gifts weren't meant to be examined too closely. Some guardian angels wore shadows instead of halos, and she'd stopped believing in the conventional kind years ago anyway. 3 months after Larry disappeared, Claire found an envelope in her mailbox with a single typed line: "Meet me where it started. Saturday, 7 p.m. Below it, an address in the warehouse district she'd never visited but had seen on security footage she wasn't supposed to know about. Saturday evening, she drove across town with her heart hammering against her ribs, curiosity finally overwhelming the caution that had kept her alive this long. She told Julie she was meeting a friend, which wasn't entirely a lie if you counted guardian angels who operated from the shadows. The warehouse loomed against the twilight sky, industrial and imposing. The side door was unlocked. Inside, ambient light from high windows painted everything in shades of gray and gold, making shadows dance across concrete floors. Stephen Easton stood in the same spot where Julie had found him 3 months ago, his dark suit and beard giving him the appearance of something carved from the building itself. "You're the one," Claire said, not a question. "All of it. The loan, the money, the job, everything. Your daughter asked me to scare away her monsters." Stephen's voice was rougher than she'd expected, like someone unaccustomed to explaining himself. "She paid me $47.50. I told her to keep it." Claire's first response was anger, white-hot fury that her 7-year-old had walked into a place like this, had approached a man like him. But the anger dissolved almost immediately into the realization that Julie's desperation mirrored her own, that her daughter had simply possessed the courage Claire had lacked. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help us?" Stephen was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Because I was 8 years old once, hiding behind a couch while my father raged. Because I remember what it feels like to be small and scared and certain that nobody was coming to save you. He looked at her directly then. Julie walked through that door, and I saw myself. I couldn't turn away from that. What do you want from us? Claire's voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. Nobody does this for nothing. There's always a price. I want to know what it feels like to be something other than what I've become, Stephen said simply. Your daughter gave me that chance. She looked at me and saw someone who could protect instead of destroy. Nobody's looked at me that way in 20 years. He told her the truth then, about his business, about the violence that funded the protection he'd provided, about the moral complexity of using instruments of fear for genuinely protective purposes. He didn't apologize for what he was, didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply laid it bare and let her decide. Claire studied this man who dismantled her nightmare and asked for nothing in return. She was pragmatic enough to understand that morality wasn't binary, that the world operated in shades of gray that people with clean hands refused to acknowledge. No expectations? She asked. None, Stephen confirmed. Just two people who understand survival, recognizing each other in the dark. Claire nodded slowly. Not romance, not debt, just mutual recognition that sometimes salvation came from unexpected places and a wisdom to accept it without demanding it fit comfortable definitions of right and wrong. Fall dissolved into winter through irregular meetings that felt less like obligation and more like choice. Coffee shops where Claire talked about difficult patients and hospital politics. Quiet parks where they walked while Julie played on equipment she'd once been too anxious to enjoy. Conversations about ordinary things, weather, books, the small frustrations of daily life that had nothing to do with violence or survival. Stephen met Julie officially in November, in a warehouse transformed from criminal stronghold into something approaching warmth. He'd had it cleaned, the industrial grime scrubbed away, a chest set waiting on a table near windows that now let in light instead of shadows. Julie approached him without fear, recognizing the man who'd kept his promise even though he'd never made one. You're real, she said, as if she'd half believed he might be something she'd imagined. I'm real, Stephen confirmed, and taught her chess with the patience of someone discovering he possessed capacities he'd thought burned out of him years ago. She saw the protector, not the criminal. It was a gift he hadn't known he needed. Christmas brought anonymous packages, new winter coats that actually fit, toys chosen with care, a substantial deposit into a college fund that wouldn't mature for a decade, but represented belief in Julie's future. Stephen's business associates noticed he'd become less volatile, more measured in his responses. Violence that had once been his first language became a last resort he delegated to others. Claire opened slowly, sharing pieces of her history in fragments. Her failed first marriage at 22 to a man who'd seemed safe until he wasn't. Her determination to survive for Julie's sake even when survival felt like all she had left. Her fear that accepting Stephen's help made her complicit in whatever darkness funded it. New Year's Eve, Stephen watched fireworks with them from across the park, close enough to ensure their safety, distant enough not to intrude. He was learning the difference between protecting and possessing, between being present and being invasive. February brought Julie's 8th birthday party, attended by school friends who knew nothing of warehouses or monsters. Stephen sent flowers with a card signed simply S and a gift certificate to the bookstore Julie had mentioned loving. Claire texted him a photo of Julie's smile, and he saved it like evidence of something good he'd managed not to destroy. March meant their first real date at a restaurant far from his territory where no one knew his name or reputation. They talked about who they might become rather than who they'd been, about futures that existed beyond survival mode, about the possibility that broken people could build something whole if they were careful and honest and refused to repeat old patterns. "I'm not promising redemption," Stephen said over dessert neither of them was eating. "I'm just promising to try being something different." "Different is enough," Claire replied, and meant it. April morning arrived with the kind of light that made promises feel possible. Stephen stood at the warehouse windows watching dawn break over the city. 6 months since a 7-year-old girl had walked through his door and asked him to be something other than what he'd become. Larry Fletcher's contract had ended 2 weeks ago. Stephen's people confirmed he'd taken a permanent position on another rig, this one in the North Sea, as far from the city as fear and self-preservation could carry him. The threat was neutralized not through violence, but through the understanding that some men ran when given the chance, especially when the alternative was facing consequences they'd spent years avoiding. The red envelope still sat on Stephen's desk where he'd placed it that first night, unopened. He picked it up now, the paper soft from months of existing in limbo, and walked out in a morning air that tasted like renewal. The park was 10 minutes away, and he found them easily. Claire spreading a blanket while Julie chased a butterfly with the unself-conscious joy of a child who'd forgotten what it felt like to be hunted. Julie saw him first, her face lighting up with recognition that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with trust he'd spent half a year earning. She ran to him, and Stephen knelt to catch her, this small person who believed he could be better before he believed it himself. "You came." Julie's voice was pure delight. Claire waved from the blanket, a gesture that said, "Come join us," without needing words. Stephen sat cross-legged on the checkered fabric, the red envelope still in his hand, feeling more out of place and more at home than he'd felt anywhere in 20 years. Julie noticed immediately. "You never opened it." "I didn't need to," Stephen said, turning the envelope over in his hands. "You gave me something worth more than money." "What?" Julie asked with the directness of children who understood that important questions deserved clear answers. "You reminded me that I could choose," Stephen said quietly, "that I didn't have to be what I became, that monsters can decide to stop being monsters." He handed her the envelope, pressing it into her small hands. "For your college fund. Every penny." Julie opened it carefully, counting the money with the seriousness of someone who understood its weight. $47.50, the price she'd been willing to pay for safety. She looked up at Stephen with ancient wisdom in young eyes. "You were never a monster," she said simply. "You were just scared like me. But you're not scared anymore." The truth of it settled in Stephen's chest like light filling spaces that had been dark so long he'd forgotten they existed. He'd spent years building an empire on fear, teaching others to be afraid of him while being terrified of what he'd become. A 7-year-old girl had asked him to scare away her monsters, and in the process, she'd shown him that the worst monster had been the one inside himself. The belief that he was beyond redemption, that violence was his only language, that men like him didn't get to choose differently. Julie's question had unknowingly purchased his liberation from that prison. They sat together in morning light, 3 people who'd found each other in darkness and decided to walk toward dawn. Not a family yet, but the beginning of one. Not redemption earned, but transformation chosen, one decision at a time. In the darkest places, sometimes the smallest lights shine brightest. And sometimes asking for help from the most unexpected person changes everyone involved. Remember, monsters aren't born, they're made, which means they can be unmade, one choice at a time. If this story reminded you that even broken people can choose to protect instead of destroy, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Comment, "Monsters can change," if you believe redemption is possible. The only people who won't engage are those who've given up on humanity, and I know that's not you. Subscribe now, and let's continue sharing stories that matter. Only abusers and their enablers walk away without taking action. Don't be like Larry. Be like Julie. Be brave enough to take a stand.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do check it out.